let's talk about Red Faction for a moment. This is one of those franchises that's been around for a very long time, but never really felt like it reached the notoriety it could have achieved. It was relatively popular, but always skirted just under the radar of mainstream popularity, even as it was breaking all sorts of new ground. The series goes all the way back to 2001 with the original Red Faction, which was an extremely early PS2 title and was a groundbreaking game at the time, utilizing what was called geomod technology, which allowed you to alter the environment in an organic fashion, something that was extremely novel at the time. Later they released Red Faction 2, which at the time received critical praise, but I've heard it more heavily criticized in the modern day. Whether or not it's deserving of that criticism is up to the eye of the beholder. I'm not an authority on that subject. The series then went to sleep for a little while as Volition, quick to prioritize new ideas over old ideas, and incidentally, can I get a new Descent game one of these days, worked on the Saints Row series for a couple of years. But that is not dead which can eternal lie, and after 7 years, 2 Saints Row games, and an excellent Punisher game, they came back to Red Faction in 2009 with what I believe to be the absolute apex of the series, Red Faction Guerrilla. Oh yeah, before I go on, I should mention that I'm playing Red Faction Guerrilla Re-mars-tered, the remaster of Red Faction Guerrilla that came out in 2018, which is not necessarily indicative of the quality of the original release, but I just wanted to put that disclaimer here. Now, on the surface, this game doesn't seem all that special. First of all, the graphics are pretty boring because it's set on Mars, so it's just a lot of desaturated reds and an orange sky, so there's not much interesting to look at. The story is fairly run-of-the-mill with somewhat mediocre characterization and a plot progression that's fairly standard. Alec Mason comes to Mars to make some money as a miner, but his brother is killed by the Earth Defense Force for running with the Liberation Front for Mars, the Red Faction. And Alec is declared guilty by association, so is forced to join the Resistance, and eventually through sheer dumb luck leads it to the liberation of Mars. But things don't go smoothly. They run into a faction of native Mars dwellers called the Marauders. The Red Faction is nearly wiped out at one point apropos of nothing and mostly off screen. Your main female companion ends up being one of the Marauders, so you and the natives have to work together to rid the Earth Defense Force before their giant warship lands and blows up what remains of the Red Faction to Kingdom Come. Nothing special, but not terrible either. Perfectly passable. The mission structure is fairly repetitive, especially the side missions, of which there's only a small handful of variations. Most missions don't have checkpoints, which leads to a lot of repetition. The NPC AI is laughable all around, the vehicles all handle like bricks, and the world is fairly empty. Generally speaking, it doesn't seem like the greatest game on the surface, but it's a prime example of a game that can be as bad as it wants to be, but can have a single saving grace that elevates it not just to being great, but to being legendary. And that is the destruction physics, or Geomod 2.0 as I believe it's called. This is a game wherein every single individual object in the world, at least that's not part of the terrain, can be realistically smashed and destroyed piece by piece. And they give you all the tools you need to make the most out of this. A sledgehammer, triggered explosives, and various other explosives. They even give you what's called singularity bombs, which can create a small black hole which when placed in the right spot can destroy an entire building in one go. Damn, that's cool. If you know anything about these games, you probably don't need me to tell you this, because for the people in the know, this is the primary selling point. But if you don't know, it's very easy to assume this game probably isn't very good. But let me assure you, this game has such an organic and id-tickling gameplay engine that it makes pretty much every flaw within the game completely null and void. Oh, the story is a bit generic. Oh, well, I just drove through a building and had it realistically collapse as I drove through. Oh, the graphics are a bit dull. Well, I just took out a building's foundation and watched it crumble. Oh, you only have 4 weapon slots, and you're usually not given enough ammo moment to moment. Well, I just stuck triggered explosives onto a building attached to a hillside and watched as the support structures were destroyed, causing the entire building to collapse over the hillside. Organic destruction is possibly the most satisfying thing a game could possibly do, but it's obviously so rarely done. It's definitely a bitch on the processor. Having a building be a couple of polygons is the usual standard because it's much easier to render something that's a single solid object that's unmoving and completely unfazed by the world around it. But rather than that, games that have full destruction have to have it where each building and each item can be broken into hundreds of individual physics objects that break away organically and in any combination, not just in a predetermined way. So that's why you rarely see this type of thing, despite how much fun it has the potential to be. One of my pleasures in gaming, which may or may not be guilty, is the feeling that what I'm doing is affecting the world around me. I like to finish up a battle and be able to look around and observe how my actions have changed the battlefield and have altered the world around me for years to come. That's why I prefer games where NPCs don't fade after you finish them off. At least not until you leave the area, and the more destructible pieces in the environment, the better. It's just not as interesting if the bodies fade away and even the scorch marks left by grenades fade away. At that point it feels so artificial. Which was definitely necessary back in the day to keep games running at a playable level, but I'm glad that's not really a thing anymore. Immersion in a lot of cases relies on little details. I remember the first time I played Infamous 2. You fight these gigantic dudes, I believe for the first time in the warehouse district, and a lot of the set dressing in the warehouse is destructible. And I have distinct memories of the first time I fought one of these guys and just walked around the battlefield after it was all over. I was just surveying the landscape. Something about that just sticks with me as one of the most memorable moments from when I was playing games as a teenager. But with Red Faction Guerrilla, the entire game is built on that feeling. And it leads to so many wonderful organic moments, like how there are these 4-story buildings towards the end of the game. I loved using my jetpack to get on top of these buildings and use my sledgehammer to cave in the roof, which will cause falling rubble to break everything on the way down. There are so many emergent moments of gameplay that you run into going through the game like this. Fun moments that you can't really get in near enough any other game. And there are some things I could mess around with for literal hours, such as the giant bridge suspended over a chasm early on into the game. I would make sure to have a save point before this section just so I could destroy it in different ways over and over. Dissolve all the supports and watch the whole structure collapse, break a few holes into the main road and try and drive over it in such a way to catch the edge of the hole to further expand it. Break just enough of the bridge so that people will still drive over it, but where they'll get into an accident or even fall through. There is so much fun to be had, even with just this bridge. Along with Just Cause 2, this was one of those games that seemed too good to be true at the time. But where Just Cause has hit arguably the highest highs and lowest lows that it could possibly hit since Just Cause 2, Red Faction has remained relatively dormant since Armageddon, with the only exception being the remaster of Guerrilla that came out in 2018. And what amazes me the most is that this game was on Xbox 360 and PS3 originally. Consoles that were groundbreaking and revolutionary for their time but seem so quaint in hindsight. For people who grew up in the same era as me, this might make you feel really old, but 7th gen hardware is comparatively ancient these days. Most smartphones are more powerful than these consoles, so the idea of anything running on these systems is a bit surreal in hindsight, let alone something this ambitious, so it makes you really wonder, wow, imagine what modern developers could make if they had this level of ambition and innovation in mind. How big and detailed they could render fully destructible buildings. How many pieces could you smash them into? How far could they really push this concept on an up-to-date system? These are the questions that unfortunately nobody have bothered to answer. So what exactly is the unfortunate truth about Red Faction Guerrilla? Well, let me explain. Now, of course there are games that have attempted to do something similar, such as things like the multiplayer mode in Crackdown 3, or most notably things like Teardown. But I think Teardown, while it is an admirable attempt, it doesn't quite capture the same spirit of the physics in Red Faction Guerrilla. On one hand, the graphics are much more basic, with most physics objects being quite large, and it doesn't quite feel as reactive because the pieces you break don't really break into smaller pieces. They either break off the larger whole, or they just disintegrate, so it feels like you're popping bubble wrap instead of creating true destruction, and the physics aren't so advanced that buildings will collapse if you blow out 3 of its 4 walls. A building will only collapse once you break everything off, and only from there, depending on the shape of what's left, will the remaining rubble collapse in an interesting way. It's a good idea in theory, and the game itself is by no means bad. Far from it. I actually think it's a very solid game. It just doesn't quite feel as organic, and that mostly comes down to the production value. It doesn't nearly have a look or feel as good or better than Red Faction Guerrilla, and nothing I've seen since has attempted to fully recapture that same feeling. Probably because it would be a bitch to program. Even something like what Teardown did probably broke the bank. So whatever technology Volition was using at this time is some black magic that only they managed to capture. But my question is, how many developers are even attempting to make this a reality? I don't know the answer, but not enough in my opinion. What's funny is, I was about to say there's no way for Volition to even make a new Red Faction game because the rights were left with THQ Nordic after THQ proper went out of business. But after looking into it, the rights have actually since transferred back to Volition because Volition is owned by Deep Silver, which is owned by Plyon, whatever. which is owned by Embracer Group, and Embracer Group is the parent company of THQ Nordic, so through a contrived series of mergers and deals, the rights have since returned to Volition after a decade or so. But if I'm being honest, that might actually be worse, because quite frankly, I'm not sure if they're capable of making a worthwhile follow-up. Volition has had somewhat of a fall from grace recently. Back in the 7th generation of games, they were one of the flag bearers of fun sandbox games with this, as well as the Saints Row games, which had their ups and downs, but were always at least enjoyable. But the cracks started to show as soon as they made Saints Row 4. Now, I love Saints Row 4, don't get me wrong, but they did reuse the sandbox map from Saints Row the 3rd. Fun or not, that's inexcusable. Then after Saints Row 4, they've essentially done nothing but try to milk the Saints Row franchise in increasingly half-assed ways. First there was Gat Outta Hell, which was a decent standalone expansion to 4, but it was an 8th gen game that looked like a 7th gen game, and once again reused large chunks of the sandbox map from Saints Row the 3rd. Then there was Agents of Mayhem, a sort of alt-universe Saints Row that was mediocre as hell, and it had a new sandbox map, but one that was insultingly small given the era that it came out, and once again, they didn't seem like they were putting their best foot forward presentation-wise, especially compared to the standards of what the average consumer had come to expect. It came and went, and nobody really seemed to notice. And then they made the Saints Row reboot, which was universally panned. And yeah, it got the series back to its roots by bringing everything back to gangsters fighting for territory in a quirky sandbox, but I was never too hung up on the Saints Row series getting away from gangsters fighting because I was more interested in whether or not it was fun, not whether or not the series stayed the same. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think Volition have really pushed their tech all that far in a very long time. I mean, the Saints Row games have always looked slightly behind the times, mostly because of how much you could customize your character, but it was never egregious. However, the 2022 game looks like a late-era PS3 game, just with prettier lighting. And I saw a video where the 2022 game's mechanics were compared to GTA San Andreas from 2004, and San Andreas actually had in some ways more mechanical depth than a game from nearly 2 decades later. I think whether you're one of those people that say it's a disappointing step backwards or an exciting return to form, I think it's an undeniable fact that it's not what it could have been. And I feel like it's because they didn't escalate the concept or fully utilize the technology. This really didn't seem like they were putting their best foot forward. To be able to get the most out of the Red Faction concept, you would need people who are willing to take full advantage of modern technology, and I don't think Volition as a studio is capable of that if their recent history is anything to go by. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe it's the publisher more than anything. But if it is Volition, the problem is they're the people who hold the rights, so if we do get a proper sequel in the Red Faction series, I don't have faith that the concept can be done justice by a modern-day Volition. Which sucks because Red Faction has so much potential in a modern setting. Even in 2009, they can make a great game out of the concept, which to this day is still one of my favorite games of all time. You know, at one point the concept of a physics engine was incredibly novel and only a select handful of games had one. Then as time went on, more and more games decided to incorporate a physics engine, even games that realistically didn't need one, like XCOM, and now it's basically something that's so standard that it's weird if you don't have one. Well, if I were to pick one gameplay element to become standardized to this extent, it would definitely be destruction physics. Does every game need destruction physics? Hell no. It would probably make a lot of games needlessly obnoxious if the walls are constantly falling in on you. But it would probably elevate a lot of games that would otherwise not be very interesting, especially sandboxes. Linear games probably couldn't make the most out of it, but with the standard sandbox game being such a mundane thing these days, this could be the thing that elevates the lesser sandboxes. Like, I remember playing a bit of Far Cry 6 at one point a while back, and it was just so bland. Even playing it co-op couldn't save it. But just how much better could it have been if instead of just shooting a couple of guys on a nearby parkade, you could collapse the entire parkade on top of them? Or how about Just Cause 4? That was a game I've said before couldn't have missed the point harder if it tried. But if I was able to destroy everything and not just predetermined objects, that game would have been way better in my eyes. Games as a whole, I feel, are a lot better now than they were back in like the 7th and 8th generations. I feel as though developers as a whole these days have embraced variety much more than they did between like 2009 to 2017 or thereabouts. Maybe not as much as they did in the 6th generation of games, but we're not in the era of endless, samey military shooters or Uncharted-style third-person shooters anymore. While there are a lot of standardized elements in AAA gaming these days, we find ourselves with a much more healthy variety of gameplay styles, and even if AAA doesn't tickle your fancy, with the ease of which people can make games independently, there are more games as a whole being developed than ever on average, so if you're willing to put in the effort, anybody can find something to their specific tastes. You'd be wading through piles upon piles of crap, but they are there. Despite all that, it still amazes me that outside of Teardown, there haven't really been any majorly publicized games that have even attempted to have fully destructible environments since Red Faction Guerrilla, and even Teardown doesn't quite do what I want it to. Maybe the game I'm looking for is out there somewhere, but I would like for more developers to at least try to do this. But it's likely not something that's gonna happen, and that right there is the unfortunate truth of Red Faction Guerrilla. We're probably never gonna see its like again. We're probably never gonna get another game quite like it. Never say never, but the fact of the matter is, it's something that's so rarely attempted, and even in the many years since this game came out, we have yet to see something even attempt to go in a similar direction. At least from what I've seen. You still get semi-destructible environments and the odd gimmick game, but nothing like this. And that makes me sad, because something like this is simply unqualified fun. All it would take is a game doing something similar to this but on a larger scale to instantly become legendary. Time will tell, I suppose, but a man can dream. So that's my take on the matter. If you enjoy what I do, please consider pledging to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as Discord benefits, early access, and exclusive content like these fine folks right here. And a special thank you to users FarmCat84 and GAW004 for going above and beyond. Otherwise, you can support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and leaving a comment telling me what you think, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Otherwise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!